Howdy doody, and welcome back to an episode of America's Dark Places, a series where I branch out from our typical overviews of states' weird folklore and take a more focused look at the urban legends concentrated in a particular place. Today, this place is the region surrounding Mount Hood and the Mount Hood National Forest. Mount Hood is a wondrous place. It's easily one of my favorite places in the Pacific Northwest to hike, but it's also one of the eeriest. From its towering snow-capped peaks to the dense, misty forests that sprawl below them, this mountain has long been shrouded in mystery. The dark lore of Mount Hood stretches back to the Native American tribes who once revered it, speaking of spirits and strange happenings in its shadows. And even today, modern tales of strange lights in the woods, unsettling encounters with otherworldly creatures, and unexplainable phenomena continue to haunt its slopes and wilderness trails. With this in mind, I quickly want to remind you that I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and it would help me out a ton to achieve this goal if you liked this video, subscribed, and commented your favorite urban legend down below. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With that, join me as we explore the stories that make Mount Hood more than just a beautiful landscape, but a place where something darker appears to lurk too. Follow me, and let's explore this dark place. The wilderness of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, and in particular the wilderness of Mount Hood National Forest, have a reputation in the Bigfoot community, as far as I can tell at least. While the legendary Sasquatch is said to dwell all over the country, it's these old, thick, and sparsely populated forests that, perhaps more than anywhere else, are said to play host to this large, hairy creature, with one author, Joe Bielart, referring to the region surrounding Mount Hood in a book titled The Oregon Bigfoot Highway. Because of this, while I don't generally cover non-local variants of Sasquatch, I feel that I owe y'all some general Sasquatch stories regarding the region around Mount Hood National Forest. Now, to start, we might as well recount some stories from the aforementioned Joe Bielart himself. In a Guardian article I'm referencing, this man says that he's seen the legendary Sasquatch a number of times, spending hundreds of hours in the forest and even leaving offerings for Sasquatch, such as apples, to entice him to show himself. He says that in the area, one of the largest uninhabited regions of the whole country, discounting the uninhabitable deserts of the Southwest, there may be as many as 30 Sasquatches, some of which he says he's seen himself, such as an encounter with a large hairy man that he saw on Christmas Day one year. What a Christmas present. An encounter he seemingly sort of regrets because it thrust him into a group of outcasts, for lack of a better word, or people in the region who have supposedly seen the foot, that have this incredible story to tell, but no audience that would ever listen without thinking less of them. Well, trust me, you can tell this story to me if you ever want to. That being said, Joe is in the right place to be this sort of individual because, as these following stories will show you, there's good company to be had in the region if you're a man that's seen Sasquatch. For instance, while this individual is now departed, in the region there was an individual for a long time that was named Henry Franzoni, who was highly engaged in the age-old hobby of hunting for elk foot in the Mount Hood National Forest. His interest, fun as it was actually somewhat at the intersection of Bigfoot, UFOs, and the military, suspecting, from what I can tell, that there was some variety of collusion in the region between these groups, even posting that he'd modified Einstein's field equation to achieve some sort of understanding of phenomena like UFO propulsion and shape-shifting creatures. In short, yeah, he was proposing relativity could explain many unexplained phenomena. Ultimately, perhaps Henry's best-known work was a 1995 experiment where he would, at least according to him, deploy declassified troop movement sensors throughout the Mount Hood National Forest to try and track the movement of Old Size 19, aka Bigfoot. But as they were about to activate these sensors, Henry says that CIA representatives would demand he take this equipment down, and after Henry would decline this request, the equipment would be destroyed mysteriously. Apparently, later in life, a retired U.S. Forest Service employee would claim to Henry that their experiment was deliberately sabotaged to obscure the truth about Bigfoot. Now, I must be honest here. I've done my share of Lorentz transformations. I've used the mass energy equivalence equation a number of times, and I've dabbled in field equations a time or two, and through these derivations, I've never once considered that I could apply these for shape-shifting. But hey, I'm just delivering the message of what Henry was up to in his time on this earth. Rest in peace, bud. And hey, if I'm telling you what folks were up to in the region, while we're at it, I may as well tell you a couple of fun stories about Bigfoot. Our first is a story by one Linda Kennedy, a woman who was camping by a creek near Mount Hood. If you're to believe this short and sweet account, it takes place in the summer of 1984, when a woman named Linda Kennedy would pitch a tent out in the Mount Hood National Forest, near Zigzag, Oregon. Yes, that's an awesome name for a place. As this tale goes, Linda would, of course, be feeling sort of messy after roughing it for the better part of a week, and she'd opt to take a dip in a nearby creek to freshen up. When this happened, it was about 8:30 p.m., and while I don't think I'd personally get naked and hop into a creek in the middle of Bigfoot country, this was Linda's decision. And as you might expect, she would suddenly experience that all-too-common sensation of feeling, well, watched, which, I gotta admit, must be pretty common when you're naked in the middle of a dark forest. At this point, she'd look up and notice that some large, silhouetted creature was downstream, dipping its hands in the water. In this account, Linda referred to the creature as a she, and recounts that she immediately thought it was a bear, and began to retreat, but suddenly, in her head, she heard a voice, like something was speaking to her. It said, "I'm not going to hurt you, and you're not going to hurt me." She would, of course, be bewildered and would fumble for her glasses, but by the time she put them on, it was already out of sight and dashing into a nearby forest. In later accounts, she would be asked to clarify about this voice in her head, and would indeed remark that whatever this creature was, it appeared to speak to her telepathically, and clearly it had no ill will. Now, our second story about El Squatcho is a story by a logger that worked deep in the Mount Hood National Forest. To be clear about the story, I've seen it posted all over forums on the internet, but you may have heard the story told already by Basecamp Chris, one of my personal favorite YouTube storytellers. You should check him out if you haven't already. I don't mind the competition. He's a good guy. Regardless, this story follows a young man named Daniel, who was 18 years old. He was working with loggers near the Mount Hood National Forest in the summer of 1968. It's said that Daniel was called out to this area to install radio signaling equipment on yarders, or essentially gigantic heavy-duty machines used as trolleys to shuttle massive logs up and down the mountain as they so choose. On one of these days, Daniel would show up to install this radio on the yarder long after the logging crews had gone home for the day, because it wouldn't have been safe for them to operate the yarder while he installed this radio on it. Therefore, he was on site at night, navigating solely using his flashlight and the light from a generator he drug up near the equipment. To set the scene for you, surrounding Daniel in this yarder was, well, nothing but dense forest. The kind of forest you picture that, Bigfoot would be inside of. All Daniel could hear were the faint sounds of the forest and the loud whirring of the generator beside him, but suddenly, a feeling would come over him. He didn't hear anything, he didn't see anything, but he knew something was awry. Thus, Daniel would begin to pan his flashlight around the area he was in. And while at first he wouldn't see anything of note, he would quickly notice a tall pair of glowing eyes in the woods just beyond the tree line, watching him. He would describe these eyes as being, well, reflective of course, but also golden in color, and looking like those of a cat almost. As he shone this light on whatever this creature was, he would note that these eyes panned around to the right and faded away, aka it turned away and walked back into the woods. Daniel, at this point, would be scared out of his wits, but not knowing what else to do in this situation, he would decide to finish what he started and go back to work. That is, until, in classic Bigfoot fashion, the wind would shift to bring air in his direction from the woods, and he would be hit with a putrid scent, a musty scent, like those commonly reported in supposed encounters with Sasquatch. Of course, this was Daniel's cue to get out of Dodge, but his car was a decent distance away from him, and in the dark too. Thinking about whether he would try to make his escape, Daniel would again pan his flashlight around, and would again find this pair of glowing golden eyes, but this time it would be slightly closer, and because of that, he could make out the large shape of this creature's body. He would describe this creature as black, large in stature, and far taller than a man. Daniel, at this, would make a break for his vehicle, successfully making it there and loading the generator into his car. He would then enter his vehicle and drive down the mountain before parking the car and collecting his bearings, knowing full and well he'd be expected on site first thing in the morning by the loggers. Therefore, because of that, he opted to spend the night in his car rather than driving away. The next morning, he would be awoken by the loggers' bus, who he would meet on site shortly after they passed him, and he would finish installing the equipment. He would then peruse the site, looking for, evidence of whatever this creature was, though finding nothing. And the foreman on site would question Daniel about why he was offside in the morning, down on the bottom of the hill where they passed him. Daniel, of course, would tell the foreman his experience, and the foreman would let him know that he wasn't the first to report this sort of thing on the mountain. The foreman would also tell him something more chilling, that recently, near 500-pound drums were somehow tossed off of the side of a nearby mountain one night while crew was off-site, perhaps lending credence to the idea that whatever this large creature was, it was extremely strong and extremely capable of causing harm to Daniel if it so chose. So with that, what do you think? Do you think that Bigfoot roams the dense forests surrounding Mount Hood? Have you seen him yourself? If you have a story, you know where to tell me. Shoot it down to me in the comments or let me know via email. I would be honored to tell your story too. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I may love a weird bit of lore, but I'm similarly enamored by traditions, and the legend of Silent Rock in a way falls into both of these categories. As you head along Highway 26 or Mount Hood Highway, you'll notice on the southern side of the road a feature referred to as Silent Rock that's frankly more mound than rock, and was likely once connected to the hill to the north. Frankly, now that I'm saying this, you might not even notice it. It really doesn't stand out from any of the surrounding topography along the road towards Mount Hood. That being said, while you may not notice it, you'd best be aware of it if you want to have a good rest of your day. First, let's go through exactly what the tradition is surrounding this rock. In short, it's called Silent Rock for a reason. As you drive by this mound, you're implored to keep your yappers shut. Don't say a word, turn off your radio. Heck, some even say you shouldn't even breathe as you're passing this rock. Now, if you do your best to honor this place and pay it its warranted respect, they say you'll have a good day. If you're driving somewhere, you'll arrive safely. If you're skiing or snowboarding, the weather will remain decent for that activity, and you'll conclude your activities without incident. But if you don't, well, they say things that are downright gruesome might happen to you, and these things are intimately connected to the namesake of this mound. See, there are multiple stories warning of Silent Rock's power. In one, a truck driver would be singing tunes alongside his radio, and his truck would break down, backing up Highway 26, and casting misfortune across the whole region because of it. Other versions of the story even say that, rather than breaking down, the truck driver's vehicle would strike another, sending them off of a steep edge along Highway 26. Some even say that it was a construction worker that got hit by a truck after he disrespected Silent Rock's power. There are also stories that are more mundane, like that of a woman who yapped her way by Silent Rock and, she got away easy and only had a bad yard sale as punishment. And there are plenty of stories of skiers and snowboarders breaking an arm or a leg after they talk while they go by the rock. Now, as for where this story comes from, I should be honest, there's little to no credence to this tale, but it's said that this mound used to play host to Native American rituals, where local tribes would toss their enemies off of the side of Silent Rock, and that to avoid hearing them scream as they made their fateful descent, they'd load their mouths with stones, and thus, some say it is these deceased individuals, these perished enemies of the local tribes, who haunt this place, and that if you don't pay them the respect they deserve by keeping quiet, that you'll be punished in turn. Admittedly, again, this variety of story is more likely than not a wives' tale at best. Now, I know, you might think these stories are goofy at best, but some locals swear by this superstition. For instance, I found accounts from locals who said they went so far as to turn up their music as they passed Silent Rock, even screaming out the window at it, only to run out of gasoline shortly after despite filling up their tank that morning, thus missing the skiing these locals were planning on doing. Another group, a bus of children going skiing on Mount Hood, would purposefully make noise as they passed the rock, and if accounts are to be believed, all of those children who acted up as they passed the rock would end up getting hurt, breaking equipment, or losing some belongings. Now, regardless of what you believe, this stone face is home to a tradition that some claim goes back well over 100 years, and that this place is as sacred as it is dark. Who knows, perhaps something dark did happen here. I've seen time and time again while scripting this series that these places, those that were considered haunted by a ghost or a cryptid or maybe an urban legend, were often once home to some terrible things that were forgotten, if only for a moment in human history. When I hear stories as widespread as these, I wonder what happened here to garner such a time-honored tradition. If you're camping in the forests of Mount Hood National Forest, or perhaps driving along one of the many highways that run through the forest and the area adjacent to Mount Hood itself, you're liable to see something odd. As the story goes, fleeting blue lights can be seen darting around. Sometimes, rarely, these lights will enter the clearing you inhabit or pass across the road you're driving on, but more often, they're seen passing from tree to tree in the thick forests surrounding you. Or sometimes, they linger near the surface of these forests. In some rare cases, as they pass by, folks even report hearing mumbling, maybe laughter. Regardless of what these lights are doing, though, many say they have a singular purpose: to draw you into the forest, sometimes for nefarious reasons. Other times for wholesome ones, though. These lights, of course, are said to be spirits, but not just any spirits. Rather, they're said to be the spirits of those early pioneers that walked the Oregon Trail, that fell victim to disease, famine, or some unnamed cause. Pioneers often would apparently bury their dead as they approached Mount Hood, often in unmarked graves. And since these times, visions of these ghost lights, sometimes referred to as spirit lanterns, have often been reported. The following is perhaps the best-known story of these spook lights, and it actually takes place during the time of the Oregon Trail itself. In this tale, the year was 1853, and a family, with their beasts of burden and accompanying wagon train, would be sitting in the shadow of Mount Hood around a campfire as they made their way west towards the Willamette Valley. One of these individuals was a young man, aged 13, named Tommy. And Tommy, well, as he sat around the fire, something else glowing brightly would catch his eye. A blue light, hovering just beyond the tree line. He, of course, became interested in this light, and he would follow it into the woods. Hours later, his father, who, I don't know why it took him hours, but he would realize that his son had wandered off, and he and some others went searching for the boy, only to eventually come across what they referred to as a, I quote, cluster of blue lights hovering in the shape of a ring. And as they approached, they would see Tommy was in the center of these blue lights. They would run up to Tommy, and they'd see Tommy was not only staring down at a makeshift headstone jammed into the ground, but surrounding him were shadows, not people, but the shadows of people, nestled just deep enough into the darkness that they somewhat merged with it, only their silhouettes to be seen. Tommy would look at his father and the other that accompanied him into the woods to find the boy and say, "They wanted to see me. They wanted me to know that they're still here." As it would turn out, the family would hypothesize that they'd find the remains of a caravan of individuals that were lost just 3 years prior, and these folks hadn't yet come to rest. Anyways, that's essentially the story here. If you've seen a similar phenomenon, not just on Mount Hood, but really anywhere, you know where to tell me. Timberline Lodge, perched on the slopes of Mount Hood, is a stunning piece of Depression-era craftsmanship built in 1937 as part of the New Deal project. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, put hundreds of skilled workers, including artisans and carpenters, to work, and they went all out. Hand-carved beams, intricate ironwork, and a fireplace so massive that you could roast an entire reindeer, which I don't necessarily recommend, but you could really do it. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself would give an official speech at the grand opening of this place on September 28th of 1937, making it an important public project. This wasn't just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Roosevelt, from his car, since he used a wheelchair and the lodge wasn't exactly ADA-friendly in 1937, praised the lodge as a symbol of what government programs like the Works Progress Administration could accomplish. His speech basically said, "Hey, look what we built. Jobs, tourism, and a fancy ski lodge all in one." It was a way of celebrating both the craftsmanship of the workers and the economic recovery efforts of the New Deal. Over the years, the Timberline has survived brutal winters, economic ups and downs, and most famously, its cameo as the exterior of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. But don't worry, even if this hotel has concluded its role as a haunted hotel in The Shining, it's still holding on to a ghost or two if you believe the stories. The first haunted place in this hotel we'll discuss is the first aid room, where it's said that many individuals who were hiking or skiing on Mount Hood had suffered terrible accidents and were taken, and perhaps even some of them perished. Here, in particular, it's said that strange events are known to occur, electrical malfunctions and such. But while this account isn't particularly dramatic, staffs have apparently reported walking by this room only to, in the corner of their eye, see a man lying on the floor of the room in his ski pants, which are torn to shred, exposing his battered right leg. Of course, they'll pass the room, quickly realize what they saw, and double back to the room to see if this individual or the on-duty nurse need help, since this man looked pretty darn disheveled to say the least. But of course, when they look back in the first aid room, they'll see an empty room. Sometimes the lights won't even be on. There's also the famous Room 217, which is maybe haunted by tourists more so than any apparition. See, funny enough, in the movie The Shining, the family would stay in room 237. But room 237 in this hotel doesn't actually exist. Rather, in the movie, it was room 217 that had a 3 replaced with a 1 in hopes that guests wouldn't flock to the hotel and try and stay in room 217 afterwards. That being said, this didn't really work because now this room is the most requested room in the entire hotel. And yes, you can still stay in this room, but be warned, it's often requested, as I said, due to its fame, so it's pretty hard to get. It's likely not actually haunted or anything though. Of course, I've got to end on a spooky note, and finally there's the hotel's old section, or portions of the hotel that are essentially minimally renovated since its construction in the 1930s. The ghosts that supposedly linger here aren't really aggressive or anything, rather it's said that sometimes guests staying here will awake in the middle of the night to sounds of jovial laughter or talking, sometimes in their very room, or occasionally. They'll even open their doors to see some individual who they clearly are not associated with turn and look towards them, just as surprised as they are, before slowly fading away as if these modern-day guests themselves were the ghosts. These stories are interesting. I'd certainly have my socks blown off by this sort of encounter, but to me it seems at the very least this Timberline Lodge isn't harboring any dark entities. Rather, it just plays host to some people of the past. Many of the Northwest Native American tribes tell stories of a dangerous race of creatures that dwell in the forests of Washington and Oregon, including in Mount Hood National Forest. Physically, these creatures looked like the native people, or were at least said to share some traits with them, such as their height matching that of a typical human male. But these creatures, they weren't human. They weren't intelligent like us. They didn't settle into communities like us. They were proverbially others. It's said that these so-called, as they called them, stick people, were pretty much only active at night, and while they could communicate with one another, their voices sounded more like the sounds made by animals in the forests. In particular, they would sing like birds. In terms of gathering food, they never did so as a group to feed a community, but rather, they'd hunt to feed themselves alone, and they'd wear the skins of their prey, often those of deer. As for why these creatures are called stick Indians, well, it's not because they look like the proverbial stick people we drew with pen and paper as kids, but rather it's because they had a nasty habit of doing the really creepy thing of taking sticks off of the ground and kind of wiggling them inside of tents or lodges or whatever, and jabbing people with them as they slept, one of their most common meddling traits. In addition to this action, these stick people also share traits with little people legends told the world across, such as the Pukwudgie, in the sense that they are often pranksters on a good day. For instance, these creatures have no civic sense, and they're more than happy to take some fish that a human may have caught, or perhaps even steal some clothing that's left out to dry. Nothing terrible, but certainly annoying stuff. That being said, if you threaten these people, these stick people show a darker side and display what are frankly terrifying powers. These stick people literally have the power to affect the human mind. When enraged, they can choose to go so far as to hypnotize people or even drive them mad. They can also cause anxiety, and they say that just the mere presence of these so-called stick people in the vicinity of a human at night, when their powers are at their height, can drive people nuts as they wander through the woods. They're also known to kidnap people, using their otherworldly powers to disorient them before luring them to their lair, where they may make people in the woods their little worker ants, so to speak. So if you're in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, particularly around Mount Hood, and you hear a bird singing or something at night, maybe head back to your tent, head back to your lodge, or even head back to the city, because it sounds like this could be the stick people, and the stick people are bad news. Also nestled in the Mount Hood National Forest is Little Crater Lake, a spring-fed marvel that, despite its modest size, about 100 feet across and 45 feet deep, boasts a striking resemblance to its larger namesake, Crater Lake. Its formation is best attributed to artesian water forcing its way through soft volcanic rock, creating a blowhole that resulted in the lake's steep overhanging walls. The lake's crystal-clear azure waters maintain a brisk temperature of approximately 33.3 Fahrenheit or 0.7 Celsius year-round, making it more suitable for admiration than a refreshing dip. If you visit Crater Lake, it's a stark area that's frankly mind-blowingly beautiful. But in addition to a picnic or some hiking, you might also find that this little spot will treat you to a ghost or two. See, back in the day, as the story goes, 3 teenagers, a woman, and 2 men went for a dip in this lake at some point, and it's said that they didn't anticipate that its temperature would be so close to freezing, and jovially, they dove right into the lake. Sadly, I've talked about this before, if you don't know, the human body has a very specific response to coming into contact with extremely cold water. Your body will immediately gasp for air, but given they took a dive into this crystal clear pool, they would inhale water, and the cold fluid would quickly sap their strength as they tried to regain their composure and make their way back to the bank of the lake. Despite it being a warm summer day, they would perish in this lake only to be found a week later, their tents still pitched around it. Because of this supposed passing, which from what I can tell might have actually been a true event rather than a tall tale, there's an urban legend surrounding this place. This legend says that succinctly, if you want to encounter the ghosts of these perished young individuals, that you can visit Little Crater Lake at night. If you do so under the right conditions, some say a full moon night in the middle of summer, you might hear mumbling, the voices of these teens having fun, and then you might hear a splash or even feel water splash onto you. Soon though, something will happen that feels less like a recording of past events. Hands will surge out of the water towards you, grasping at your leg, and you might be grabbed by the hands of the departed as they try to escape the near icy waters they're trapped in, perhaps dragging you down with them into the cool waters of Little Crater Lake for all eternity. Also, I guess to lighten the mood, for whatever reason, it's said that a white house cat also haunts this small lake, and that many individuals visiting the lake note its presence, and that if you follow it, it'll fade away before your eyes. This one doesn't seem particularly nefarious, and in some circles they even say it's a good omen to see the ghost of the white cat, or a reflection of someone's kind nature. Regardless, if you visit this quaint spot in the summer, I highly implore you to take care and make sure you keep your hands and feet at least 4 to 5 feet away from the waters of the Little Crater Lake after sundown. Those cool waters may feel good on a hot summer night, but I promise, they're not worth the potential downside of having to spend eternity in them. Back in the Oregon Trail's heyday, there was a camp near Mount Hood, a place at the base of a hazardous hill named Laurel Hill that was, well, super steep. So as you read these historical accounts, you'll find that it was a pretty common sight here for wagons to fly out of control down this hill, approximately landing inside of the camp. This camp, of course, was located on the site of the modern-day Rhododendron Village, a place named for the plentiful rhododendrons growing in its vicinity. This village's buildings that you see today are, while spiritually tied to this place's significance along the Oregon Trail, the live remnants of an unincorporated community that started out as a summer resort, but eventually would become lived in year-round as skiing grew in popularity. Regardless, like all places with fading paint, this place is of course said to be a bit spooky. To start, the ghost lights we talked about earlier, those blue lights that called out to the kid Tommy, those are plentiful here. Beyond that, some folks that visit some of the old buildings in the area, for instance the bunkhouses, have reported that despite being pretty much alone in these buildings, they've heard plentiful footsteps, and sometimes the sounds of a piano inside of the building playing, despite the seat next to the piano being unoccupied. This piano, by the way, it's got a mirror on the front of it, and while I can't share this copyrighted photo, one individual claimed to take its picture, and clearly in that mirror you can see the face of an old woman as if she were sitting there preparing for a performance. There's also the kitchen in the mess hall of this community, which is supposedly stewarded by an old ghost that refuses to leave his post. I'm a sucker for this sort of great work ethic personally, and it's said that this ghost has that in spades. This ghost is said to be that of an old cook, and supposedly he still abides by his old routine, showing up to work early and all. And because of that, the door to this mess hall supposedly swings open on its own every day, right at 4 a.m. I guess he's getting ready to make some locals some biscuits and gravy or something. Lending credence to this tale is that in 2001, some graves were found near this mess hall. Though I should note, these graves did have etchings on them, and they were clearly not that of a semi-modern cook, but rather those of a pioneer and a Native American. That being said, who says they don't fix themselves breakfast every morning? I sure would if I could. Beyond this, in other buildings in the community, it's commonplace to experience unwarranted electrical issues, to hear your voice whispered from an unoccupied room, or to simply see glowing lights outside of your bedroom if you awake in the middle of the night. Personally, this place sounds marvelous to me. My whole stance on ghosts is that I would be honored to be the first person to ever see and then be obliterated by a ghost on camera for the sake of science. So, if you know a surefire way for me to encounter a ghost in this honestly lovely looking aged community, you'd better tell me how down below. So I've sort of talked about this before, but I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss some Native American oral history in this story about Mount Hood. So I'm going to discuss the story that led to its formation. The story is also the story of the origin and destruction of the nearby Bridge of the Gods, a natural land bridge that formed across the Columbia River for a time, effectively damming it. So to be brief, the Bridge of the Gods, this natural dam, was formed when a chunk of Table Mountain broke off, likely due to an earthquake, causing a massive landslide with material sliding into the Columbia River Gorge and halting the river's flow near the modern-day Cascade Locks in Oregon, an event you can still see evidence of. This event, of course, created a land bridge that to this day is recounted in Native American oral history, where you can hear legends of people crossing the Columbia River on foot. Now, of course, today the Columbia River flows, so we already know that this natural dam didn't last forever, rather eroding away, and that eventually broke through the Bridge of the Gods, washing away much of the debris and forming the Cascade Rapids, a feature which today is submerged after the construction of the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia. Surrounding the creation and destruction of this bridge, as I said, is the origin story of not only the land bridge, but also of Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, and of Mount Adams. Here is one of the many ways this legend is told. In this tale, the chief of all gods and his two sons, Pato and Waist, traveled down the Columbia River from the far north in search of a place to settle. During these travels, they came across an area that is now called the Dalles. The area they stumbled upon here was beautiful, and the sons therefore fought over ownership of the area. The chief of all gods, in his wisdom, shot 2 arrows, one to the north and one to the south, ordering his sons to settle separately across the river, and then the chief of the gods built the Bridge of the Gods so that his family could meet now and again. Of course, this tale also tells of the collapse of the bridge, and this tale follows a love quarrel between the two brothers. The two sons apparently had similar taste in women, and both fell in love with the same beautiful maiden named Luet, who could not choose between the two. In their fight over her love, they created a bit of destruction, devastating the land and destroying the bridge that joined their territories, creating the Cascade Rapids of the Columbia River Gorge. These two, after he saw their destruction, were struck down by their father, after which they were transformed into mountains where they fell. Wyest, with his head lifted in pride, became Mount Hood. Pato, with his head bent towards his fallen love, was turned into Mount Adams. Luet, the woman they were fawning over who also perished in this, also became a mountain, becoming Mount St. Helens. Again, there are a handful of other legends that tell of Mount Hood's creation, but they have similar themes in common with this one, and this is the one I saw told most frequently. So this is the origin story in Native American oral history of the legend of the three mountains, including Mount Hood. Okay, I've gotta be honest, telling this story of the Pacific Northwest tree octopus is a freaking blast from the past. I remember opening this website telling the tale of the tree octopus in 8th grade as I sat in Stormin Norman's computer class, reading the article and wondering if this so-called tree octopus was actually real or not, as I carefully made sure that my teacher didn't see that I was not practicing my typing skills. This creature that is near and dear to my heart, the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, is said to be native to the temperate rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula in western North America. Their life cycle is said to be extremely unique among cephalopods, and while they spawn in the waters of the Hood Canal that juts off of the Puget Sound shortly after birth of these octopi from eggs, they'll spend only a couple of months in the waters of the Hood Canal, growing, and then will do the distinctly un-octopus-like thing of migrating towards land and taking to the trees to live out their days. Here in these trees, it's said the Pacific Northwest tree octopus will camouflage itself in the color brown to avoid predators, the most notable of which are bald eagles and, of course, Sasquatch, and they'll grow to a size of 30 centimeters across. It's worth noting these cephalopods are ambitious, preferring to rest in pools of water within the rainforest. But when those are lacking, the moist air of the rainforest still offers them just enough water that their well-adapted bodies can retain moisture, allowing them to live in the trees, snapping up their favorite snacks, insects and small birds. They navigate these trees and hunt using their extremely well-adapted tentacles, but also their eyes, which are said to be more capable than those of humans in the water, and similarly well-adapted to life on land to us hairless apes. Ultimately, as expected, the tree octopus will eventually return to the Hood Canal and end its life cycle when the male octopus's sperm is deposited in the female, and the males will return to the trees of the forest around the canals, while the females protect the eggs until passing away of starvation. Now, as for their numbers, sadly, the tree octopus is said to be endangered, in large part because the keen eyes of those aforementioned eagles and the strong noses of Sasquatch make them easy to pick out, no matter how well camouflaged they are. Also, the encroachment into these habitats by suburbia, roadways, and logging activity is increasingly driving these already scarce octopi into smaller and smaller habitats. Furthermore, these octopi were prized fashion pieces in the early 20th century, and their habit of spraying ink at logging equipment, often breaking it down in the process, earned them a bad, almost omen-like reputation among loggers, who were known to put down the poor creatures without any real cause. In short, there's strong anti-tree octopus sentiment among loggers. These factors are driving the tree octopus towards extinction, and any day now, sadly, we might see it on the endangered species list, or possibly worse. Fret not, though. There are people actively championing this cause. For instance, in May of 2010, there was a tree octopus awareness vehicle at the Baltimore Kinetic Sculpture Race. And in 2009, there was even a demonstration by students at a local elementary school in Ohio to bring awareness to the plight of the tree octopus. Who knows, with these young minds concerned about the tree octopus, maybe there is a future for the species in the forests of the Northwest after all. We can only hope. Now, last thing of note, if you Google the tree octopus, you'll see Google say dumb stuff like the Pacific Northwest tree octopus is not real, and that it was an internet hoax created in 1998 as an example to teach kids about the importance of verifying information online. And sure, that's a compelling case. I mean, I doubt you'd even heard of the tree octopus before this video, but trust me, that's just misinformation by big calamari. Those squids are always trying to make it harder for those octopi to live. Trust me, the Pacific Northwest tree octopus is 100% real, and absolutely deserving of your attention, and the attention of the nation at large. folks, I've got a confession. I really missed touching on these more concentrated places. I love covering states as a whole, and that's not going anywhere, but man oh man, thank y'all for welcoming these more focused looks at folklore with open arms. Again, this is a new series for me, and it takes a hot 20 hours or so to make one of these videos between scripting and editing, so if you want more of this, all I ask of you is to let me know by commenting, liking the video, and subscribing if you can. If this video does well, I'll be sure to make more like it. Otherwise, whether you just saw a strange, tentacled little creature moving through the trees, or if your friend turned on his radio while y'all were driving by Silent Rock, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.